Tough. Good evening, everybody. We are going to start tonight with a brief, I think it's 50 seconds, video. As soon as I find where I left. Hang on one second. Let me find it. Share screen with sound. And here. Okay. Let me explain to you what you're going to see for about 55 seconds. And then I'll explain. It's how fire can restore forest burning through time. I'm going to watch this, and then I will explain why we're seeing something that has seemingly nothing to do with the Jewish history class. Mark, you can't hear me, right? Mark, no. Okay. Let me just message Mark just a second. Okay. Let's watch this. Okay, what is it we just saw here? We saw a forest. There was a fire. It was burned down. It was a controlled fire. And then as a result of the fire, stuff grew. So what's going on here? So we know, if you know a little teeny bit about the way forests work, especially when you talk about a forest that has pine trees with pine cones and stuff like that, or seeds that are on trees, what happens is you'll hear this popping sound during the fire. And what's eventually happening is that the seeds of those pine cones and other things that are attached to the trees, as they burn and fall to the ground, they're actually planting new seeds, the regeneration of the forest. Okay, so obvious question is, what does that have to do with price tea in China? Why am I mentioning that? Okay, so last week where we left off was we're talking about the decline or the end of the time period of the Gaonim. And as we're going to move on, I'm going to tell you the story of the four captives. The general idea of that video is that when something burns down, not a person's house, God forbid, but a forest or an idea or a time period, very often built into the original item, such as the forest or a civilization, the seeds for the future are being planted at the same time. We saw, for example, at the very beginning, that out of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash came the eventual growth of the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Babylonian community. That was all came out as a result of starting off with Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, moving to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, also known as Rebbe, moving into the time period of the Talmud, so that what looked like the demise, what could have easily been the end of a Torah-based community, a Jewish community centered around God, because there's no more Beit HaMikdash at that time, the seeds were there and were planted for the future. So that's the mashal of the parable of what tonight's about. What I want to talk about is, before I get to the story I promised you about the four captives, a little bit more about the ending of the time period of the Gaonim, also known as the Gaonic period, and the academies of Torah in Bavel. We're going to talk about that, about the four captives. We're going to talk about, there are two major areas that we're going to focus on over the next few weeks. One's going to be Western Europe. Mostly it's going to focus, actually, I shouldn't say Western Europe, mostly around Spain, Portugal, northern part of Africa, and then we'll talk about some other parts of Europe also, which is basically going to boil down to eventually the growth of the Sephardi world and their Torah scholars and the Ashkenazi world and their Torah scholars. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. So let's talk about what were things that were happening. Why was there a decline, which I only briefly talked about last week, a decline in the Gaonic period, in the academies in Babylonia? So there were a few things. First had to do with political changes. The caliphate, which is like the ruling dynasty of the Muslims, which parenthetically the Muslims are looking to reestablish or to establish what's known as the 12th caliphate around the world today. So Muhammad is whatever. You can fill in the blanks. In any case, the Abbasid Caliphate, which is the ruling caliphate at the time, that the Jews are in Bavel or in Babylonia, it's starting to fade. It's starting to lose its grip, and there's a tremendous political instability. And almost any time there's a country where the Jews are flourishing, and then it turns out that there's political instability, the Jews have a problem with a continuity in them. So in here too, this political instability affected Jewish communities. In addition to that, because of the political instability, there's also an economic problem. Because of the problem with the economy, with the politics, the trade centers, remember, the world didn't revolve around the Jews. We may think it did, but it didn't revolve around the Jews. Babylonia was massive. The Jews are about this much of it. For us, it was very important, that little bit, because it had the Surah and Pumbedita. But because the financial world was suffering, therefore the rich people who were supporting the yeshivot, these academies, were unable to, or maybe in some cases unwilling, to fund the yeshivot anymore. They didn't have the necessary resources any longer. At the same time, another thing that's pushing the decline of the academies in Babylonia is what's going to become a major focus for us in a few minutes, and that is the growth of the Jewish communities in Spain. At that time, it was known as Al-Andalus. For those of you who are familiar with Andalusian music, it comes from the concept of Andalus, which was Spain. The Gemara refers to Spain as Hispania or Aspania, but we're going to use the word Spain just so we won't get messed up here. So as there's starting to be a decline in the area of Bavel, now there's a growth in the area of Spain and Northern Africa. And they start to develop their own scholars as well. And they rely less on the scholars of Bavel, meaning the Gaonim. In addition to that, because we're Jewish, unfortunately, not unfortunately, we're Jewish, because we're Jewish, unfortunately, we also tend to have internal strife. And there were rivalries within Jewish communities, different leaders, not so much the Gaonim themselves, but what we call today the Gvirim, the people who were the machers, the people who really were into helping run a community. We don't know exactly when Surah and Pumbedita, the last two remaining academies, were actually closed, but we're talking about approximately the year 1034. So if we're going to round it out, we're going to round it off. We're talking that the period of the Gaonim and this academy of Surah, which closes in 1034, and Pumbedita around 1040. So in very, 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 very broad terms, the time period goes from approximately mid 500s to 600, all the way till about just after the year 1000. Okay, it's a few hundred years is the time period of the Gaonim. The Rav Hai Gaon, as we talked about at length about him last week, his death in 1038 pretty much marked the end of, and the end, if we're going to somehow bracket a time period, 1038 to 1040, when finally the doors of Pumbedita closed, that's the end of the time period of the Gaon. Now, I mentioned before that while the academies of Pumbedita and Surah and Bavel are starting to decline, there's an uptick and a growth of tremendous scholarship in Spain and in Northern Africa. And that's what will become the Sephardi communities and their scholars, which we're going to learn in depth about a number of these people, not so much tonight, just a little bit tonight. And then there'll be an emerging community in what will become known as Ashkenazi communities. And the word for Ashkenaz historically referred to Germany, even though we know that it does not only revolve around Germany. It's going to be much, much bigger than that. You know, it includes Poland and many other countries. But the world of Ashkenaz starts off very, very tiny. The world of the Sfaradim actually starts off much bigger than the Ashkenazi world. So the aftermath of these doors closing of these academies in Sur and Pumbedita is that there's this tremendous amount of knowledge that's still there. Remember, one of the hallmarks of the time period, the Gaonim, was a huge growth, in the writings and the letters that went back and forth, and the responsa and the commentaries that were written. These texts migrate now to these other parts of the world, again, Northern Africa, Spain, and Europe, other parts of Europe. There's new leadership that starts to grow. I'm going to mention some names, which some will sound familiar, some you'll maybe have no clue who they are, but each one deserves a class by themselves. I mean, literally, that we'll talk about some of these at length. There's the Rif, Yitzhak Alfasi, in Northern Africa. There's Rashi, France. I'm sure everyone has heard him. And all there's, we sometimes think like, okay, Rashi starts from scratch and he builds his Torah knowledge. And the Rif, just assuming for right now, he was a tremendous, not only Torah scholar, but also have to do with halacha. But he starts from scratch in his own derech, his own path. It's not like that at all. It was a result of them having the benefit of much of the writings of the Gaonim in these two parts of the world. And finally, there was, as a result of the yeshivot shutting down, that all these writings weren't just limited now in this one area. Again, like I say, they spread to other areas. There is a story. It's called the story of the four captives. And the story is believed to be somewhat of either a fable or have some modicum of truth to it. It's told in a story, I have it written down here. It's written in a book by a man named Rabbi Avraham Ibn Daoud, in a book called Sefer HaKabbalah, which in this case doesn't mean Kabbalah, like the mystical part, but rather just the book of tradition. And he talks about a story of four distinguished Jewish scholars who were on a ship. Their names were Rabbi Hushiel, Rabbi Moshe ben Chanoch, Rabbi Shemaria ben Elchanan, and a fourth one who was not known what his name was. And what happened? What's the story that's so important, so pivotal that it comes to this time period? Late in the, let's say in the 900s, as Babel is starting to wane, as Spain and others are starting to grow, these four people were sent by the yeshivot, by Pumbedita and Sura. They were sent with their wives and their families to leave the country to try to potentially fundraise overseas. Now, that's a theme that repeats itself also in Jewish history, not only today that we know that we call them whatever, people like shlichim, people were messengers, meshulachim. They're also called shadal, which we'll talk about in the early days before the beginning of the state of Israel, in the early days of the first and early time period of the Aliyah. So these people that I mentioned before, Rabbi Shemayahu, Rabbi Hushiel, Rabbi Moshe, and a fourth person, are sent on a mission to go and try and fundraise in different parts of the world, mostly again Europe and that part. But they set out by sea, and they're in the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean was a dangerous time period, dangerous time at that time, because there were a lot of pirates. And this is where someone would go, "Ayi matey," but it's not. And there were pirates, so it was a very dangerous mission. Nowadays, putting away the Houthis and all those Jew haters. Generally speaking, you want to go in the Mediterranean on a cruise or something like that. There's no danger to that. But at that time, it was a dangerous place. So what they undertook was not only were they going to go fundraise, but they're doing it and taking the lives in their own hands. And pirates at that time were not only looking for what they call booty, but they were also looking for people that could kidnap and sell as slaves. So it was some early days of slave trade, early days of pirating things and stuff from people. But they knew one thing very critical. The pirates knew the Jewish people. They knew that if they could capture Jewish prominent people, that they had a payday waiting for them. because the Jews would always ransom their folk because it's considered one of the most important mitzvot in the Torah. Matter of fact, one was allowed, as we know, one's allowed to sell a Torah scroll to use the proceeds to buy back and to sorry, to rescue a Jew or Jews who have been taken captive. Some of you may remember a few months ago that Rabbi Brul, who is the son-in-law of Lisa and Rob Zettelman, gave a shiur at the Lifshitz home in memory of Ari Zettelman, Shem Yikom Damo, who was killed during Hanukkah in the war. He spoke about the topic of this, of redeeming captives over the history, in Jewish history. It was great. As a matter of fact, I asked his permission to use it. This past Pesach, I gave a shiur on it, and I said it was his work, not my work. But understand that the concept, what's called in Hebrew, Pidyon Shvuim, is a very, very big mitzvah, redeeming captives. So these pirates were not only pirates, but they were also Talmidei Chachamim. In quotes, they understood. They were wise Torah scholars in a sense, not for being Jewish, but they understood that the Jews were worth money because the people would pay anything to get them back. Why? Why is that? Why is it such a great, gigantic mitzvah? Because Jews are not museums, we're not artifacts, we're not a culture. We are people, and people have to be saved from kidnappers. And a Torah scroll won't do anybody any good if there's no one to learn from it. So that's part of the theory behind why we have to do anything we can, in most cases, to redeem captives. I'm not talking about what's happening right now in Gaza. It's a different story, because there it's not a matter of money. There it's a matter of, well, as you know, I don't have to go into it tonight. So evidently there were some informants that the pirates had. They had spies in all the docks. And they knew that these 4 rabbis and their wives and the children were shipping out. And they were only about 2 or 3 days out of port, and the rabbis were captured. They were brought to slave market in Alexandria in Egypt. Rav Shmaryahu was ransomed almost immediately by the locals. The pirates, however, were not able to get enough money for all 4 of the rabbis. So the remaining ones, the other 3, were brought to the slave markets in Tunis, Tunisia, and Fez, Morocco. At that point in history, Tunis and Fez were what we would call, maybe in the early days of the United States, the wild, wild west. It was every man for himself. There were Jews there, but there was no great leadership, no great rabbinic leadership. There already were Jews there at that point, and they saw a golden opportunity. They saw these Torah scholars. Remember that when the academy sent these people out to collect money, they weren't sending some, sorry for the term, but some schnorrers, just like some guys who are just gonna, like bums are gonna ask for money. These are Torah scholars who were representative of what the yeshivot were. It was very important. So when the people in Tunis and in Fez became aware of who was in their community and that they were captives, they made a deal. It actually made a golden deal. They said that before we make a deal with you, our dear pirates, we want to talk to these rabbis to make them an offer. And what was the offer? The offer was that they will ransom them on one condition. Now, were they allowed to do this? Not allowed, immaterial. It's what they did. They said, we will ransom you on the condition that you decide that you will stay here and grow a Jewish community, a thriving Jewish community of Torah here in these cities of Tunis and in Fez. And of course, in Alexandria is already starting because of this other Rav. So Rav Hushiel and his son Rav Hananel, they agreed. Rav Moshe was in Tunis and in Fez, and Rav Moshe was ransomed in Spain. According to legend, again, whether it's true or not, I have no idea. Legend is that his wife, the man who was ransomed in Spain, threw herself overboard and drowned in the Mediterranean. The 4th rabbi was shipped off to Sicily, and he was ransomed over there. So what happened as a result? If you came in late, you maybe missed, but I showed a video at the very beginning of a forest, a controlled burn in a forest. It burns down, and then as a result of what fell from the trees, it plants things in the ground, and the forest grows again. This is exactly what's happening here, because these 4 rabbis built yeshivot, and eventually students emigrate to these countries to grow a community. They are attracted by these new Torah centers, so that within approximately 50 to 80 years, which is a very tiny, tiny sliver of history, North African Jewry is no longer subservient, second fiddle to Babylonian Jewry and the Gaonim. And as a result, they have their own new communities. So that's how it is possible that when, again, is the story verified that's 100% true? There's no one who can tell you it's 100% true. It has absolutely ring of truth to it, because considering the time period of history and the piracy that was known on the high seas, et cetera. So yes, that is possible. But let's talk about for a minute, what was the significant impact that they had by being released and redeemed into these communities. So like I say, number one, they established new centers of learning. It's not that Pumbedita and Sur were closed already and now they open it up. It was concurrent. It's going on the latter days of these two major academies in Bavel. The other ones are starting to open in these other countries. They established new communities, they established new yeshivot and mikvaot, and become the centers of Torah learning. In addition to that, there was something else that we haven't mentioned much in these last couple of classes. We're focused on the writings of the Gaonim, of the Shelot and Shuvot, the Responsa, and their commentaries on Torah. But one thing that we haven't really talked about is what was going on in the yeshivot. In Psur and Pumbedita, remember, this is the time period minus the short window of the Savel Ra'im, of they're learning the Talmud, becoming scholars in Gemara and in Talmud Bavli. So what's happened now also is that because these four rabbis have been moved to these other centers and they established the centers for themselves, so to speak, not for themselves, but for their communities, it also then moves the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, from only in Bavel for the most part, because remember, in Israel there was a Talmud Yerushalmi, and in Bavel, Babylonia, was the Talmud Bavli. Now the Talmud Bavli starts to migrate to other new centers of Torah. So that's, again, as a result of these four rabbis. In addition to that, they blend some of the traditions of Babylonia that the Jews knew from there into the North African and Spanish Jewish traditions. It makes the culture of the Jews thrive, makes them more cohesive, and connects them better to the other Jews in different countries. The long-term influence, of course, is something that we to this very day, literally until this day, benefit from. This time period, after these rabbis start settling these communities, lead into what we will learn about shortly, is called the Golden Age of Spain. The Golden Age of Spain gave us, as I mentioned before the name, the Rif, Rav Elfasi. It gave us Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who wrote the Kuzari. It gave us the Rambam. It gave us so many tremendous Torah scholars that all of their actions and their writings, and what especially comes to halacha, will bring us to the point a few centuries later to the writing of the Shulchan Aruch, which of course is our code of Jewish law, which is to this very day what we use for deciding halacha. So the end of the period of the Gaonim and the spread of Torah in these other countries can be traced back probably to these four scholars. And of course, as I said, signifies the end of that time period of the Gaonim. What I want to do is to give you just a little bit of background now on what's going on in Spain. Because Spain is going to become one of the main sources of Torah scholarship. We will focus tonight on two of the scholars when we get to them, a man named Hasdai ibn Shaprut and Shmuel HaNagid. And first, a little bit of background. Why is it, and I only said it like really briefly, but why is it that there was a flourishing, let's just again focus on Spain, a flourishing of Torah scholarship and a growth of Jewish communities in Spain? So you can attribute it to one person, that's fine. But in order for it to grow, you can have, let's say, for example, you wanted to plant a tomato seed or tomato seeds and plant tomato plants. So you can have the best seeds from the strongest tomatoes you can find. But if you plant them in earth that's hard, or it's not conducive and doesn't have water or some other problems, the seeds are worthless. They will maybe grow something, but it's not going to be of any value. Same thing is true here. When we're talking about Torah scholars being planted in these other countries, it's not in a vacuum. It has to have some way of being able to be to cause them to flourish. So what's really happening in Spain? At that time, they're still called Mohammedism, whatever how we pronounce it. We're just going to call them Muslim. It's just a lot easier to say. There was Muslim rule at this point over Spain, and they were actually very good to the Jews at this time period of history. They also, while they're still very good to the Jews, they're still making their attempts to convert the Jews, and it's to their best interest to be on good terms with the Jewish people. What they did have in Spain, which they were losing in Babylonia, was the economic thriving, the growth, the economics was terrible in Babel by this point. Things are all the way going down the tubes. And in Spain, things are on an uptick, not because of the Jews, but because of what's going on in Spain itself. Remember, the Jews are not the focus of the world, although they are when it comes to Jew hatred. But they are, in fact, not the focus, but what's going around them is what's important. The Jews had the right, which is very unusual for this time of history. They had the right to own land. And if you know anything about the times in the Middle Ages, which is the little drop after this, in England and in France, and the Jews had none of these rights. And by the way, most people didn't have rights to own land. It was just when you were in a caste society, when we had what we called the serfs, and you had other, and that's its own world. But here, they actually had the right to become farmers and own land, but they needed the means to do that. Many of them didn't have the means to do that. So what do they end up doing? How do they make a parnassah? How do they make a living? They became local or international merchants. Now, again, I said, in order, but go back to that parable about the seeds of a tomato plant. You can plant, if you plant those seeds in lousy earth, it's not going to grow anything. So in order for them to grow, there had to already be an infrastructure that helps the economy. It wasn't the Jews weren't making the economy. So there was a very good economy in Spain at this time, and they piggyback onto this. They become very successful. In addition to that, at that time period of history, Spain was known as the most cultured, wealthiest country in this part of the world. So the Jews who are starting to grow this new center of Torah in Spain luck out because they have this infrastructure. They have the culture that's surrounding them. They have the economic situation that's helping them. And the Jews are influenced also by the culture that's around them. Just as one absolute nothing to do with anything right now. When you look at an Ashkenazi shul and the way it's set up, and you look at a Sephardi shul and the way it's set up, you will see a very strong difference. The Ashkenazi shuls are set up in rows. And a Sephardi shul, in many cases, not all of them, I daven in 2 or 3, and only one is shaped like this. It's more like a row, a bottom, and another row, like a chet, the shape of a chet or a U. And the question is like, how did that come about? So because the Jews of Spain were influenced by the Muslims, and in a mosque, it was more considered appropriate to be shaped like that. So that's how it was in the shuls, in many shuls, till this very day. If you go to the kotel for a bar mitzvah, you go to the kotel for shachris one day, Shabbat, whatever it might be, and you see a group of Sfaradim, they're getting ready to daven, you will see they set it up like this, and that, like a U or a chet. Sfaradim, Ashkenazim were influenced by the Christian world because the part of the world they're in, but it's France and England and in Germany and Poland, which are not necessarily these names yet. They're being influenced by the Christian world, and churches were set up like pews, just rows, which is why, very broadly speaking, the Jews that have a Sephardi background are in the shape they are, and Ashkenazim have a shul in the shape they are of the seating. But again, there's dozens and dozens of cultural things also, whether it has to do with the type of music, has to do with the type of foods. All these things seeped into the Jewish communities, both in the Ashkenazi world and the Sephardi world. But again, let's stay focused on Spain. In this world of Spain, there are dozens of names, but two I want to start with just a little bit of information on each one of them because they each deserve some mention. We're going to, over the next few weeks, learn about a number of people from this time period. You've heard of Ibn Ezra. You've heard of Rabbi Yehuda Levi. If you haven't, you will. The Rambam comes a little bit later still. But there are two names I want to talk about first tonight. One is a man named Hasdai Ibn Shaprut. Now, again, I've mentioned this before. When you mention some name like Ibn Ezra, it's not Ibn Ezra, it's Ibn, I-B-N. And it's the same word as means it's from Arabic. It means Ben, the son of. So Hasdai Ibn Shaprut means Hasdai, the son of Shaprut. He's born around 915 in Spain. And remember, just keeping the timeline in mind, we're talking now at the very, very, very end of the time period of the Gaonim. So he's born one of the first births after that time period in Spain. His father was very wealthy, very learned. He gets a tremendous amount of education in Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin. Latin was very rare for Jews to know at that time. And not only was it rare for Jews to know, it was rare for most people to know because it was just really known as the language of the clergy in Spain. So because a lot of scholarly work was written in Latin, not just the words of the church, but scholarly work already by that time period, a lot was in Latin. So he also decided he needed to learn Latin. And another thing he learned is medicine. And a theme that seems to run through a lot of these tremendous scholars, especially in Spain, is they learn medicine and they end up becoming the physician to the king or the caliph, the head of the country, which we know the Rambam was the head guy's doctor. So too is Hasdai ibn Shaprut. Because he was his doctor and he was privy to always having an audience with him, he became a confidant to this man. His name was, I had to write it down, I would never remember it, Abd ar-Rahman III. I guess the second was not up to speed, so he's the third. Caliph Abd al-Rahman, the third. So Hasdai is working for him. He's not only a great Torah scholar, he's a tremendous doctor, and he has tremendous political skills too. He becomes his confidant of we'll just call him the king. It's just easier than saying Caliph Abd something or other. He becomes the confidant of the king. He becomes his counselor. He, in a sense, acts as the shadow foreign minister because he's helping him dictate the foreign policy for Spain. Put a parenthesis here for a second. Remember, we're talking about just rounding up year 900. We know that 500 years later, the Jews are all going to be kicked out of Spain. We know that about 200 years from now, all the Jews are kicked out of England. This is a recurring theme. But until the Jews are kicked out of somewhere, they somehow seem to manage to get top, powerful positions. Even in the United States to this very day, we've seen in the last many administrations, powerful people who are Jewish who have served in the president's administrations. So he becomes, like I said, the shadow foreign minister. In addition to that, he's given control. This is like mind-blowing. And that's why I like learning and teaching Jewish history, because we think of these people, Hasdai ibn Shaprut, for example, as a Torah scholar, but he was so much more than that when you realize what he influenced us with Torah, which we'll talk about. And now you see what he did there in Spain. He also became in charge, was given control of customs and the ports and all this money that was due in the port of Cordoba. And he also helped forge foreign alliances. So here we have somebody who, that kind of a position today would be like taking somebody like, let's just say, Rav Chaim Kanievsky Zatzal. You take him and you have him he's a doctor also, and he's, let's say he's in the United States. He's the president's doctor, and he's working somehow as a shadow member of the cabinet, and he's also in charge of the shipping ports in the eastern seaboard of the United States. That's what the power this man, Hasdai ibn Shaprut, had. Then something happens. There's an Emperor Constantine, a Byzantine emperor, who bought A codex. A codex is it really means like a code of something. But right now, let's just say it was a book on botany. He bought this fancy book, and it was written in Greek. And that happened to be another language that he knew. And he translated it into Arabic. And it made this book accessible to the Arab world and eventually to medieval Europe. And this is his entree then also into the world of culture and the world of other things that have to do that's important in the world of Spain. He then becomes invited by many Torah scholars in this part of the world and others, and he continues the very little that's left still of last people that are still in Babylonia. He's still corresponding with them, and the problem is that we don't have a lot of his written work. We know how influential he was in the early days. That's why I'm not spending a lot of time on him, because when we come to somebody like the Rambam eventually and Rashi and the Rif, who we will talk about in Spain, there's so much more to talk about, not just who they were, but what they did and what we have to this day. But there's at the same time, maybe 50, 60 years later, there's another man whose original name is Shmuel ibn Nagrila. Shmuel ibn Nagrila becomes known as Shmuel HaNagid. Those of you who are familiar with Yerushalayim, if you're walking on King George Street, and let's say you're at the King George in Yafo, you're by the light rail, and you're walking towards, like away from the city, towards the direction of Emek Rephaim, and you walk, and you have on that same street, you have the great synagogue, you have the Jewish agency, you have multiple hotels. On the right-hand side of the street, as you're walking again towards the direction of Emek, you come to an angle street that goes an offshoot from King George on an angle heading up, and that's called Shmuel HaNagid. This is the man we're talking about right now. He was born, as I say, Shmuel ibn Nagrila, in Cordoba, in Spain. He's known as a Talmudist, a grammarian, a philologist. If you don't know a philologist, I would fancy myself as a amateur philologist, as someone who studies words and loves words. So a philologist, a soldier, a merchant, a politician, a poet. He was what we would call today a Renaissance man. He had his finger in so many areas, not like Hasdai and Shaprut. He was more in the political and the Jewish world. He is more in the influential area of writings. He has to leave Cordoba around the year one. I'm just rounding it off because it makes no difference to us right now. Around the year 1000, he has to leave Cordoba because there's a civil war. And that civil war, remember, whenever some civil war is up, there's unrest, what happens is automatically who's going to be one of the first casualties? We know it's going to be the Jews. So there's a civil unrest, the Jews, and he starts to run away, and he goes to a city called Malaga. Next week, Bezrat Hashem, I'll put up a map so we can see where some of these cities are. And then he moves to Grenada. He becomes a great poet. He is a writer in both Hebrew and Arabic. And at this time period, by the way, it is very, very common that many of the scholarly works are written in Arabic for one very simple reason. A lot of people didn't understand Hebrew. We talked about this already last week. A lot of people didn't understand Hebrew. And in order to get Torah to the masses, it had to be in what we call in Latin, the lingua franca, which means the language of the time, the people, which in this case is Arabic. But interestingly enough, because he's proficient in Arabic, he comes to the attention of somebody in the government who becomes a personal secretary and advisor to this person in the government. So somehow he still has his foot is somehow into the government, but not any official capacity, unlike Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who did. He becomes a communal rabbi. He is a director of a Torah academy. He's like the Rosh Hashiva Torah Academy in Grenada / Granada, however you want to pronounce it. He encouraged the study of Torah. And what happens is that Granada becomes a major center of Torah education. We're used to in modern times, when you talk about, say, the United States. Let's talk about Israel first. You talk about Yerushalayim and Bnei Brak and Yerucham. I'm just throwing one out. Almost every community you could find some major scholars, but there's some big areas that we have a lot. The United States, we can talk about Lakewood, you can talk about New York City, and there's just so many areas in the United States, and Chicago and Baltimore and Cleveland and in Boston. There's these major centers of Torah. If I were to ask you to name the top 10 in history, no one's going to come up with the name Granada. But it was, at this point, is a very, very important center of Torah. And he also is a poet, which we call a paitan. He writes a tremendous amount of stuff that gives contributions to this very day of the literary time. It also leads in the Muslim world to a renaissance in their poetry, because they are seeing we don't just learn from them, they learn from us. So it was a tremendous uptick in the amount of poetry and writing at that time. They were both Hasdai and Shaprut and Shmuel HaNagid were very significant people who had not only made an influence in their time period, but left their mark. As I mentioned, Hasdai's work is not as extensively documented, but his contributions to literature, his contributions to science, his translations, his correspondences, those still exist and they're significant. He actually translated a medical text. I'm going to tell you the famed official name. It was called Pedanius Dioscorides, from Greek to Arabic. Might as well be in Chinese as far as I'm concerned. But it became, at that time, which was modern time, of course, because that what they were alive, it became a resource for both the Arab world and medieval Europe eventually. So Hasdai, even Shaprut, has this influence way beyond the Torah world. And Shmuel HaNagid we actually have plenty of his works. He wrote 3 works that are lesser known. One's called Ben Tehillim, Ben Kohelet, and Ben Mishlei. The reason he chose those 3 names is that Tehillim, Kohelet, and Mishlei, which are the book of Psalms, the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, and the book of Mishlei, the book of Proverbs, are the 3 books written by Shlomo HaMelech, and he calls them Ben Mishlei, Ben Tehillim, and Ben Kohelet. He uses a theme and a style that imitates those 3 books, but it is his poetry and his work and his contribution. There's a book called Selected Poems. I don't know what language it originally was written. My guess is Arabic. That is now available even in English to this very day. If you have nothing else to do with your life, you can always go online, Google the words Shmuel HaNagid and written works or poetry, and you will find plenty of stuff out. Okay, this is just like a peek into the very, very beginning of the golden age of Spain. What I'd like to do next week, besides putting up a map on the screen so you can see where they are, is give you a list of many of the important personalities that lived at that time. We're going to start focusing on that. It's going to take us a few weeks. We're going to talk soon, a few weeks to talk about those personalities in depth about each one. And then when we finish that time period, we're going to go back to the beginning of that same time period, and then we're going to look at the Ashkenazi part of the world of France and other cities. So you may say, like, as we go through this, why aren't we talking about Rashi? Because Rashi's in France, and we're not in France. We're in Spain now, in the Moorish countries right now, and Northern Africa. So that's what we're going to focus on over the next few weeks, Bezrat Hashem. Okay, in the meantime, a good evening to all, and B'sarot Tovot. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi.